No, thank you very much, Ken. Thank you, Padma organizers of this event. And thanks to all the colleagues for being here. So as Ken had introduced to you, this book is on this topic of reversals. And here you find the content table. Basically, I'm going to skip quite a number of beginnings and go straight to the main issues in the book. The idea is to have those sectors and the performance across these countries as a way to actually see how countries grow or not grow. I specifically focus on agriculture and agribusiness because we believe that that's where Africa has comparative advantage. And if they were able to do that, they would have done exactly what Asia did centuries ago. As all of you know, India and much of Asia achieved their own green revolution in the 60s. Africa has not managed to do that. So I looked at all the sectors and very specific products to see how policy shaped the evolution of those sectors. The last part is on the thing that doesn't seem to be, fully addressed, I believe, leadership and industrialization, and also the capacity of the states to actually move these things forward. So the central question here is, why has Nigeria, and by extension, actually, you can look at almost all the African countries, like Sub-Saharan Africa, why have they experienced reversal of economic fortunes? And in plain terms, reversal actually refers to the decline in economic performance. And of course, you have reduced GDP growth, increased unemployment, and heightened poverty levels whenever there's reversal in growth. There are three broad theoretical explanations for reversal. The first one is what many of you here are probably acquainted with, structural transformation theory. Basically, economies modernize by transiting from subsistence agriculture into industry, and of course, the more advanced ones go into services. What you find here is that labor moves away from subsistence agriculture into industry, which has higher productivity growth. Europe achieved that 250 years ago. Like I said, Asia 80 years ago. The second broad theory is about resource dependency, which I discuss in chapters 4 to 7 of the book by making the comparison between all of those sectors. In essence here, a lot of countries have become resource dependent. Resource richness is by itself not an issue. It's about dependency on those resources for your income. So when you have income concentration to the point where every kind of change in the global market begin to disrupt your economy, there's a problem. And what we find is that whenever a country achieves or rather experiences this shock, it's always difficult to recover, even after things have normalized. When you go deeply into their structures, they hardly ever recover. And if these disruptions continue, and you have several of them, as we have seen in Africa, it actually leaves very long-lasting problems in those economies. The final theory that we also looked at for the policy economic perspective was about leadership, institutions, and so forth, the kinds of issues that many countries that struggle with colonial past have actually struggled with. Now, what we find here is that in terms of growth of these countries that we pair together, there has been wide gap between Nigeria and Asia. And whenever I say Nigeria, you can always map in almost all of the African countries south of the Sahara. Many of these countries achieve poverty reduction, greater income equality, others contested. In contrast, Nigeria became more poor, while all these other countries were able to build their economies to the point where they used the windfall for crude oil and minerals to raise the level of their infrastructure. Nigeria has oil, Nigeria potentially has one of the brightest people on earth in science, in technology, all over the place. But somehow the country never manages to harness this potential. They all over, go to the US, go everywhere here. But somehow the country just never manages to harness that potential. Even the oil, listen, we export crude oil and import finished products. On the Dangote refinery, which is the biggest refinery in the world, 650,000 barrels a day. It's the biggest refinery in the world, built by one person. One person. The state has not succeeded to build what we built. They don't operate them. There are 3 big refineries that didn't operate. So you talk about capacity of the state to manage the industrial process. We used to export commodities, oil palm, coconut. We got left behind by competitors. And in terms of the, when you look at the average share of average income movement over time, this is what you see. This is part of the analysis we did in the previous book. This is share of average income over time. Like as you see here in the 60s, we were at par with almost all the Asian. In 1980, Nigeria's GDP per capita was 6 times that of China. There's a famous study by the World Bank towards Korea and Ghana. Ghana was far ahead of Korea. So the point is that you put all of this together, and the claim of reversal is incontestable. Africa has actually experienced reversal of fortune. Much of the details in the book, for those who be interested, we divided them into decades. And we find that at similar economic levels in those years, in those decades, there have been income divergence between Nigeria, most African countries, and Asia. In the 70s, oil price benefited many of the African countries, Nigeria, Angola, all of them. For some reason, we were able to, again, use those monies for building the infrastructure as Malaysia and other did. Then came the 80s, the oil crash. It was a decline across trade that left lasting impact on the way we do business. And then the reliance on primary resources. This is really at the heart of resource dependence. It has been, people have looked at it, but when you look deeply, it has far more insidious impact. Because when you rely on resources, for me, the most important part is that you pivot away from tradables, agriculture, industry, and the learning that goes with it over a long period of time is lost. Manufacturing is not something you do by magic. It has to be by explicit policy and investment determination over time. When that is lost, a lot is lost. And this is really the heart of the problem. For many people, it's about the Dutch disease. Okay, there was elevated price in oil, exchange rate volatility. That is far more important for me in terms of the industrialization part of those countries, which we highlighted in the book. So, and also apart from the loss of revenues from value addition, even the cash crops itself, we began to lose that advantage. Many of these countries totally went into oil, into minerals, and neglected what, for me, was most important. And the worst part is that countries that used to feed themselves are now importers of food, Nigeria and all of these other countries. And the last point I made here is about the fiscal space. When you depend on oil, everything in human capital, health, education relies on income from oil. When that goes away, just look at the hospitals, schools. We went to one of the best schools, I believe. My friend here, we were in Ife together. In Ife, in those days, when you go to Ife, you go to Wisconsin Imperial College without anybody worrying about whether you do well or not. It's no more the case, So the issue at the heart of the book is, this so-called giant of Africa. How did it end up being what it is now? So these are details that I don't want to go into too much. I looked at all the reversals, especially the shocks. That we had some analysis on the shocks and how over time, when shocks persist and they become more frequent, you find that economies never recover from certain areas unless something extra also comes to intervene. For the book, specifically, the periodicity for us is 1970. I know there are studies that go back hundreds of years, but we decided to stick with the period when we have enough data to prove exactly what we're saying. Reversals, of course, we find here is not uncommon. It's always very rapid, very sudden, like we saw with COVID. Decades of growth is totally wiped away within weeks, as we saw with COVID. In fact, COVID gives us the biggest illustration. In much of the cases we've had here with oil crashes, many people don't notice what has happened to those economies. And the full reason behind reversals could be very complex. Sub-countries will recover better than others. But for the most part, for countries without the technological capability to respond, the impact can be very devastating. So to understand reversal, we looked at certain regions, technology for us, and the technology behind industrialization. As you know, there are 3 levels in which you can categorize industrial hierarchies: low tech, middle tech, and high tech. Many of our countries have stayed at that low tech. Even there, they're not doing very well. Textile, garments, rubber, and all of that. And that's actually where we took our starting point for this particular analysis from. Then we find that there's a growing income gap, like we said earlier. And what we find behind the income gap is also the gap in the scientific and technical knowledge. Information is free, but knowledge is not free. Everyone can go to the internet and read about how to make a bomb. But how to do it in actuality is a different matter. And many people confuse those two, between information and the deep knowledge that we require, the skills that you require to actually make technology work. And we say here the focus on oil has been counterproductive. Now, the key for us also here is how you best retrain and retain human capital. That is another big issue here that we find in Nigeria. There's this terminology of Japa, but people running away from the country. But not so much to look for money, but to look for opportunities. A lot of people leave not because they really think they'll get better salary somewhere, but because they cannot fulfill their own aspirations. We have that situation where many of our countries are going through now. Here, the point I made here is that most of our countries have focused more on these resources, whereas Asia focused on human capital, building their labs, building their technological capability, supporting private sector to perform. I'm not saying this has not happened in Nigeria. In fact, in the 80s, we used to employ over 1 million people in the textile industry. Then, things changed. In the 80s, mid-80s, we had a structural adjustment program. Most of the industries totally disappeared. And like I said, that's another shock from which we never really recovered. Now, so I mentioned this, that much of the issue also has to do with the fact that when you focus on resources, there's no diversification of the economy. And 8 of the 15 least diversified economies in Africa are in Africa. And we find in this book very clear correlation with GDP growth. When you focus on just resources, you find that you have a very non-diversified economy. And 5 out of 10 countries with GDP per capita above 5 rely on natural resources for over 20% of their GDP in Africa. So the key here is that that reliance, like I said earlier, tend to be counterproductive to education, public-private partnership, and industrialization. So how do we measure it? We have several metrics in this in the book. Economic reversal, we measure it from 1960 to 2022. We also use other parameters, social, technological, industrial dimensions, ADI, is part of our measures. For industrial indicators, we use a PCI, which is an UNCTAD. I think Padmash used to work on that in the past, that when we're on that. We use that. We use others, and we find very clear correlations with all of them. Basically, what you measure the manufacturing value added in industry, and also manufacturing contribution to GDP, which has remained very small in most of African countries. Unlike what UNIDO specified in 1975, I think. If you want to classify a country as industrializing, it must have at least 25% manufacturing contribution to GDP. We've never really attained to that. Now, the last two chapters of the book looked at state capacity and industrialization. For us, a typical example is, say, if you look at those industrial sectors that countries depend, resource-dependent complex, say refineries and the oil sector. After 60 years, many of them do not have companies that actually can build refineries. It's a 200-year-old technology. We still can build it because the focus is always on extraction, on having what we call short-term money. When your focus is on that, it takes your gaze away from what is important. So the capacity of the state to manage industrial ecosystem is very weak. The technology bureaucracy is very weak. And this is what we find with clear data in the book. And we feel that this is something that needs to be addressed. We pivoted away from agriculture, and things are beginning to change a little bit. The African Development Bank is working with many of our countries now on what we call the Special Agro-Industrial Processing Zone. We are building zones. We're in 11 countries. It's a project I'm actually in charge of. And it's beginning to change gradually. The whole idea is that Africa should go over to process what it has comparative advantage in. 60% of all cultivated arable land in the world is in Africa. 60%. It's not somewhere else. And you have all across the continent, everything. So we believe, and we are trying to champion that Africans should focus on that and try to add value to those commodities. You take cocoa, for example. 70% of global cocoa is produced by Ivory Coast, Ghana, and Nigeria. But we get less than 10% of the value. It's about $300 billion market is chocolate. That much of the value goes to those who process them. Of course, there are trade barriers. People say, if you want to export raw cocoa to Europe, it's tariff zero. The moment you process it to powder or other things, you get a tariff of 50%. So, but you also have the FCFTA. We are advocating Africans should trade among themselves. Europe trade among itself in manufacturers. Almost it's 9%. Same with Asia. And you find the shock from the America, I don't mention names now. What you find is a deepening of the trade within Asia. You saw Xi Jinping the other day going around Thailand, Vietnam, and saying, let's come together. So one of our advocacy is that Africa should trade a lot more among themselves. And when you trade among, you learn more. There's no point setting up an AFCFTA where you are just trading poverty among yourselves. You are exporting cassava to another country, they are exporting maize to you. It's trading poverty. A trade area should be a manufacturing area, should be a place where people are producing. And that's what the example of Europe has shown to us. Like I said, about 86%, trade, Boeing, Airbus, for example, find almost all European countries are involved in Boeing. I find Airbus. You take a typical car in Europe, almost all the European countries are involved. So this is how trade is seen regional, in regions. So I believe Africa has that way out, and we should take advantage of that. On leadership, as I said, I close here. I believe that it's an understudied area, and I really want us to focus more on it. It's something that is parametric in terms of most economists think it, given that in poorer countries, if it's not, the state control a lot of resources, and the disposition of leaders and the elite tend to do a lot that are good or bad to economic outcomes. So we believe that this is an issue that we need to take a little more seriously. The challenges in leadership in post-colonial states actually either weaken institutions if they don't obey the rules themselves. They can lead to poor coordination if they're not paying attention. And then nation building itself has to do with people who are building, instead of people building it. Whether at the scientific level, whether at the political level, you need that kind of leadership. And of course, we need capable, legitimate, visionary leadership that will prioritize investment in human resources and human capital. Thank you very much.
Next one, Chief. Padmashree, do you want to?
Well, no,
I would introduce you, but I already have. So.
Good afternoon, everybody. Actually, it's a real pleasure to be here amongst you to launch this book that my colleague and friend from a very long time has written. And it's really, I read the book, and I've been seeing the reception of the book, and I think it's very deserved. I'm just going to summarize a little bit what the book does, my takeaways from the book, and a few thoughts. So the book begins by unpacking Nigeria's decline, which caused this reversal of fortune, tracing it back to resource dependence in the country. And in the first half of the book, or 3/4 of the book, it compares Nigeria's downfall, as Panji's explained, with 4 other countries, Asian countries, Vietnam, Indonesia, Bangladesh, and Malaysia, at the sectoral level, to make a compelling case for Nigeria to move away from being a monoculture, oil-dependent economy to become a more diversified industrial economy. In the case of each of these countries, the book looks at different sectors. So in the case of Vietnam, it looks at cocoa. In the case of Indonesia, it looks at rubber palm. In the case of Malaysia, it looks at palm oil. Sorry, in Indonesia, in the case of Malaysia, it looks at rubber and rubber products. And then it looks at ready-made garments in the case of Bangladesh. Importantly for me, the main takeaway is the focus of the book on agricultural innovation, especially food crop agriculture, how it creates the basis first for agricultural self-sufficiency and then processing capabilities and development, both in agriculture and then in manufacturing in these countries in Asia. And then the book contrasts that with what happened in Nigeria subsequently in all of these sectors as Nigeria sought to build capacity in these sectors, and talks about what were the sort of intervening factors that impeded Nigeria's ability, whereas it actually helped the other countries to build capacity. In the final part of the book focuses really on leadership, institutions, and governance, and how they help to shape these trajectories of wealth accumulation and wealth generation. And the book's argument is that strong economies attain their success by implementing solid economic policies, of course, but not only those that promote macroeconomic stability, but support domestically suited growth paradigms, So have states that identify these domestically suited growth paradigms that are balanced, robust, and inclusive. So the book also ends with suggestions of how Nigeria, and by extension for me, actually the lessons or the experience of Nigeria over the last 50 years is actually quite applicable to the lessons of a large number of African countries in this context, to cultivate and benefit from this kind of leadership and vision. I want to commend both of the authors for the analysis. And I also want to, for me, the book is different from a large number of books that have been written over the last 20 years on this topic on comparative industrialization, which trace actually Asian economies versus their African counterpart in two ways. First, it looks at the last 50 years of development in a very detailed manner in a resource-dependent country, which is Nigeria. This is a very important achievement because there are very few books actually that take this very close and clear look with data and analysis of any African country that's actually resource dependent and unpacks it to show what exactly happened in that context and what are the factors that account for the failure of good governance and institutional building and, by extension, industrialization and economic development. Second, in comparing Nigeria with some of its peers, the book focuses on sectoral entry points to explain these divergences and pinpoints the underlying common factors that led to Nigeria's decline, but at the same time contributed to the success of these other countries, right? So as opposed to just the general focus on good governance and what we normally extrapolate in development economics literature, the book really talks about how sectoral and economic diversification and strong scientific and technical institutions are drivers of change. And this is, for me, a very, very important departure from the prevailing literature on this topic that explains Africa's backwardness today. And it's very important for people who are working on this topic to understand and try to intervene. In the little bit of time that I have left, I want to end with some of the broader issues that this book raises at an aggregate level. An important issue that confronts all of us who are working today on African development is to understand or explain if institutions and governance are critical for industrial trajectories in Africa, how can these countries that are being left behind cultivate and develop those state capacities or capabilities? Because over and over, people talk about state capabilities and the fact that those countries that succeeded have state capabilities. But we never begin to unpack what do those countries need to do that don't have state capabilities to build those capabilities. The idea of state capabilities, as everybody in this room knows, emerged in the 1980s with the development state literature. And it proposes that the so-called development state coordinates learning institutions and it creates the right basis for technological change. But the irony is that even as over the last 2 decades, several African countries have applied the lessons from East Asian countries and other Asian countries like India or China now for African development, they have not worked in the same way to deliver the same results. Now, why is that? The reason that I think both Banji's work shows and both him and I normally discover over and over again, and we discuss it, is that both the internal and external circumstances of countries globally and particularly in the developing world have changed radically. Externally, those spheres of influence that states could have exercised have shrunk tremendously. So take the case of East Asian countries in the 1970s and the 1980s. Take the case of India in the 1980s. Take the case of China. The amount of policy space that countries had to say what is industrial policy, what is technological policy, what are we going to do in terms of foreign direct investment, how are we going to structure that, that has shrunk tremendously with the World Trade Organization, with the agreement on trade-related aspects of intellectual property rights, with free trade agreements, with global value chains, which is why African countries grinded today to pull a South Korea, to do what South Korea did in terms of global value chains, whichever the sector you take, because there's so much policy space that has been lost, and it's very difficult to reclaim that. The second one is what Banji mentioned in his book, and I think that it deserves much more attention and a lot more work, which is that these kinds of shocks that states face that make states weaker and weaker over time, whether it's the commodity boom and bust shocks, whether it's actually the COVID-related shocks, whether it's just shocks that come from supply chains that fall apart or global value chains that don't help them to build capabilities. These shocks are critical, actually. And the more of those shocks, the weaker the institutions get with every successive shock. So countries actually lose the capacity to course correct and build. And that accounts for why the same policies or similar policies don't work today in the context of countries that are being left behind. And it also accounts for why we need to start thinking outside the box in terms of policy incentives and, a package of policies that might actually help us to think through what to do for these countries. And I think that that's where the leadership proposition that Banji proposes in this book is also important, because you need strong scientific and technical institutions, but these strong scientific and technical institutions might be leadership created, leadership driven. And once the country is able to course correct a little bit over 5 or 10 years, they might actually pull the country in a different direction and making it possible for positive institutions to evolve over time. In a forthcoming book on the topic, both him and we try to actually unpack a few of these topics on state capabilities that are really critical to pivot away from these traps and bad policy advice, particularly also coming out from outside, because states also need a lot of capacity to understand what kind of advice that is being thrown at them is good advice and bad advice these days. And we work on that, and we hope to be able to launch that book actually in the next coming months as well. But I want to end with these thoughts and also congratulating the authors once again for this fantastic book. Thank you.
David.
Sure.
Okay.
Well, I guess much has already been said, but still, I think I'll share my own insights and my own take on the book. But firstly, let me congratulate Naji and his co-author, because I think the book is a success in terms of its own research strategy. And I think the research strategy was carefully thought through. The pairings in the case study is, clearly very unique, in the way it was done. And I think it's a great contribution to what we know about how countries industrialize, also how we think about the development state, and I think many other areas as well. The processes in those specific sectors and so on, I think some insights and all that. Let me just also say that, in my visits to Nigeria, I have seen firsthand some of the challenges. I've actually been to Kaduna, been to the refinery that is described, and it's a massive operation, occupies several acres of land and all the equipment and technology that's there. And you cannot visit that facility and wonder why it's not doing what it was meant to do. It's not refining oil. Also, having visited Kaduna, I've seen for myself the factories that we call gradients, the textile clothing and the textile sector and so on. So I've witnessed all of this, but I think I've also seen very positive things in Nigeria as well, and I'll come to that later. Unusually for me, in a book, The Forward, written by Toyin, yes, Fanfalola, yes, struck me as almost a lament for Nigeria, because I read it and then I reread it because I thought that it was unusual as a forward, was very powerful, very strong, as I say, sort of almost gerrymayered in the way that it is written. However, I have to say that I have some difficulties with certain areas of the book. The first is the way that the state is portrayed, and the way that the Nigerian political economy is portrayed, because that has an impact and an understanding of the failure of industrial policy. I also have a problem with the sort of macroeconomic framework, and its selective focus on just one particular area. Now, I'll come to that in a moment. LSE is the place where Thandika Nkaliwere spent his last few years, and I think his critique of the developmental state and particular issues around the theory of patrimonialism, prebendalism, and so on. I think that critique still stands. And for me, it was disappointing to see that the book was built its critique of the state around, that theory, which I would say has now been discredited, really, and primarily by the work of Thandika Nkaliwere. I looked at the bibliography. Thandika is not mentioned. It doesn't have to be mentioned because there are many other writers who have followed in Thandika's footsteps. But I think that the insight from Thandika's work is that there is political elites do have agency, they do have choice, and these choices could be made I could have different kinds of repercussions, both positive and negative, and it's not preordained how these choices could play out. So, to me, I think the complexity of the Nigerian political economy. Again, there's a lot of literature that deals in different aspects of the Nigerian political economy. Nigeria is a very difficult political economy setting in terms of the differences in ethnicity, religion, traditions, cultural traditions, north, south, and so on. It's a complex political economy where the political elites is very difficult to attain political consensus. So to me, I think that complexity did not actually come out. And I think whilst it's not all of the explanation of the failure of the Nigerian state, but I think that complexity married with the insights of Thandika Nkaliwere could have given us a better appreciation of the failure of these particular sectors that were looked at during that period. The other aspect, which Raji, I think you alluded to, that Thandika's work touched on, was a critique of structural adjustment. I think in your presentation you alluded to this. In the book itself, it doesn't really come out very strongly, partly because I do accept that they focus the periodicity, as you mentioned, was much more in the 70s. But even so, I think that since these industries did not necessarily collapse only in the 70s, I think it's the difficulties continued well into the 90s and so on. So I think the effect that structural adjustment had should also have been brought out, and also it relates to political elites, the kind of choices they make. In some of the places, structural adjustment was resisted. In Nigeria, it was not. And I think much of the difficulties in the agricultural sector, whether it is the marketing boards, the extension services, and so on, all got it during structural adjustment. Even some of these factories that I mentioned, the Kaduna, in the clothing, textile sectors, they were struggling. again, it was not inevitable that they should be shut down. It was, reforms could have been undertaken. And so, but then again, that's where the problem of the Nigerian political elites, that sort of consensus around what development model and so on, to me, is be challenging for Nigeria. So those aspects seem to me not to be sufficiently dealt with in the book. The macroeconomic situation always provides the framework for policy, and here I think the book focused especially on the exchange rate aspect of macroeconomic policy, following on from, of course, the treatment, the view of the resource curse, the touch disease, and so on. But they don't look at more, sort of more broader macroeconomic issues. My own reading and understanding of the Nigerian economic management is that there's some areas of macroeconomic policy that have been successful. I'll come to this in a moment, especially as it especially in regard to financial oversight of the financial center. But in terms of how you manage savings, in terms of investment policy and so on, I think macroeconomic policy has been poor. One of the reasons for success in places like Bangladesh, Indonesia, and so on is that local elites have been able to use savings generated from within the economy to have a stake in these industries. Bangladesh is a place I know very well. My wife having been posted there and visited several times when she was 2 years that she was there. And what always struck me is the buy-in of the elites into the government sector is not just foreign direct investment, but the substantial Bangladeshi participation in the government sector. In the case of Nigeria, where the savings is managed, issues around, of course, the absence of this consensus that I'm referring to here does mean that you have more capital flights and use of savings internally. And just an absence of a commitment to using savings generated from within the economy for investment in the economy. So I think that aspect could have been brought out, recognizing, of course, that these points that I'm making, what we don't do in university is just to critique, because these were not, I do recognize that the key focus of the book, had a specific research strategy, but, I'm making this point to say that these are also issues that could enrich the explanation of the failure of industrialization in Nigeria. There are some things that have being done very well in Nigeria, which I think also relate to how you would view the state, how you view the complex political economy and so on. And one of the areas of success, which is not necessarily has to do with production, is all the same, is the capital, Abuja, which actually was being built around the time when this of the same periodicity of the book. I think today Abuja is a success in terms of being established as a capital. And I think this was one area where political elites did reach a consensus that the capital should be located in the middle of the country, with all the provisions that they have made to ensure, that new buildings have been put up and so places of worship and all that reflected the diversity of the country and all that. So I look at that as one distinct area where it was in the interest of the political elites to create that capital and build it the way it did, the way they did, and which still functions today. I think I would like to hear your take on this. But to me, I think Abuja has become a success as a city. It is still growing as a city, but in terms of the basic foundations that were made during the same period reflects that kind of consensus among the political elite. I did say I'll come back to the banking sector. Whilst there's been these difficulties in macroeconomic management as regards savings and investment, when it comes to oversight of the banking sector, regulatory aspects, this is one area where I think there has been success with the tough regulations around capitalization of banks, which has led to mergers, as you know, and has made that sector quite strong. And in fact, is one of Nigeria's export successes. You find Nigerian banks operating throughout the continent now. And I think that very much has to do with, again, reinforcing my point that the absence of that consensus among the elite and how savings are to be used and deployed. But whereas in the banking sector, they've been able to overcome that and operate in quite successfully. There are other sectors, of course, which are not of concern in this book that I think have been quite successful in Nigeria. Nollywood has to be mentioned, and is just as not only as interesting but as viable as Bollywood in India is. So that's one clear area of success. The Africa Business Magazine just published its list of the 250 most successful African companies, looking at a number of metrics, including capital and so on. Nigerian firms dominate that at least. And what's also interesting is not just the banks that I would mention, but across the board, including even some agri-sector firms. My point here is that to come back to Zandika, I think agency, choice, the interest and focus of the political elite, the extent of consensus, or where the consensus is aimed at, I think all of these give us some insights. I'll just end by just picking a small issue with Padmashi as regards policy space. At here, I haven't been having a rethink about policy space, especially having recently done some work on the agricultural sector and looked in particular at WTO rules as they apply to the agricultural sector. The WTO rules have various carve-outs for special and differential treatment and etc. In the case of the agricultural sector, they do have provision for what they call the development box. When we looked into this, the development box allows all the policy space that you could think of, for subsidizing, for public stockholding of agricultural products, and all these things. As one of the people we interviewed said, you could drive a truck through the development box. But what we found out that is 0 African countries have used the development box. It's being used by India, it's being used by other Asian countries, and so certainly for the agricultural sector, policy space is not particularly a problem. I do know that, of course, for intellectual property rights, for other sectors, there are, regulated investment measures and so on. But even in those sectors, there's always a way around WTO regulations. I don't really see policy space as being confining. And of course, today with the virtual collapse of the multilateral trading system, the institutions behind it, I think there's far more leeway, when it comes to policy space. Um, uh, and I'll end with this point. Another aspect, again, which somewhat related to this, where the Nigerian political elite have not shown a consensus, is how to use regional integration and the markets that go with the regional integration. Again, this came up, briefly, not so much in the book, but in Ranji's comments regarding the CFTA and so on. ECOWAS, and here one can contrast how South Africa has used SACU and SADC compared with how Nigeria has not used ECOWAS, even though the headquarters of ECOWAS sits right there in Abuja. South Africa, as hegemon, has used that market, post supply chains, and which, as he put it, to production. Recently did some work on the automotive sector, and it became very clear that countries around South Africa are part of its automotive supply chain, and also as a market for finished products. Nigeria, the Nigerian elite has not used regional integration in this way, and other than the sort of political clouds that comes from being a big player in an organization like ECOWAS, really the economic benefits that Nigeria should reap from ECOWAS and by extension the FCFTA, we have not seen that emerge. And Nigeria as a hegemon is not really showing leadership, even up to today on the implementation of the AFCFTA, despite its potential. And here also, just to take issue with you, Benji, the African economies, it has been shown that when it comes to intra-African trade, that trade is much more diversified than is sometimes thought. In terms of value-added products, about 60% of what Africans export to each other is actually value-added products, ranging from cement to beauty products to whatever. There's even factories in Abeokuta that make trident trees, and so you find all of this all along the being on and on countries that outside of Nigeria. So inter-African trade is much more diversified. I think there's a lot of data that supports this, but again, the absence of that political consensus among the Nigerian elite as to how to make use of this market has not been forthcoming. So let me stop here. But having, as I said, we're an academic institution. We're not supposed to agree with everything. That's what it's all about. But let me also go back to the first thing I said, and that is that the book is a research success in terms of its own parameters that it's set itself. The research strategy is very innovative, looking at those 4 case studies and zeroing into specific products, a lot of insights from that. The book is not meant to address all of Nigeria's problems and issues. I do recognize that. But as I've said, the theoretical basis, I think, is it's not the strongest part of the book, especially taking into account other work that has been done that gives some insight. So thank you so very much. I'm sure I've thrown the cat among the pigeons. Let's see how those who, again, want to leave provocative remarks have made. But I was meant to be provocative. I think that's what Ken expected of me. So let's stop here.
Thank you, David. Now, don't go hiding away. Why don't we all come back up here? We can hold it.
Anyway, small
plug
more advertisement for this book that's coming out next week, How Africa Eats. So you could take the information is right here.
I'm going to turn the overhead off so that we're not staring into the lights. Why don't you want to? I think I can turn this off without destroying the other glass. Yeah. Well, if I end the recording here, I apologize. That's still going. All right. So again, Platinum SV, thank you. David, thank you. And of course, Banshi, thank you very much. We have plenty of time. I want to open up the floor, but maybe we'll only spend a few minutes. I don't know if you have any quick reactions to anything, or should we go straight to the Q&A discussion from the audience? How would you like to see it? You're the guest of honor, Jerry.
Just to thank Duke and myself for the review. Of course, this book, the focus is very narrow on what I wanted to do, and we were very deliberate about what we set out to do. It wasn't it wasn't meant to address all of Nigeria's issues. Like you said, there are a number of the leadership issues that I cannot even begin to say. My background actually goes back a long way. I was within the system in Nigeria. I was with the Nigerian Institute of Social and Economic Research, and we spent 10 years actually. We were monitoring all industrial projects in Nigeria. So there's a lot that I cannot say in a book or even in the public space. But like you said, your role is to say all the states, Abuja as capital and all. By the way, Abuja was built by the military people. The civilians up to now have not been able to do anything close to what the military did. Even the refineries, the petrochemicals, all of that were done by fiat. The military did that. So the capital, was the military. So the critique of the leadership for me is something I've just started to do. And I hope to go a lot more into it. Andika was a person who respected a lot. The prebendal issue was not, we referenced in the book that we didn't use as a framework, just referenced it. But I am very critical of the Nigerian elites. And I think we should be, because, we Nigerians have a very high tempo of expectation. Outsiders can see other things. We know what goes on a daily basis. So maybe you have to excuse me on some of those issues. On the diversification of trade, which is your area, I always say, what's the quantum? You can have 60% of 1 billion. You can have 60% of 20 billion. What's the quantum of the trade? For me, at the end of the day, and what really is the value addition, that we're talking about. Africa as a whole still imports food. These are processed stuff, but those are part of the issue that we took up in the book itself. But like I said, for us, it's just the beginning of process. I want to interrogate a little bit more over time in the book I'm doing with my colleague here. It's going to take a much broader global outlook, but for me, it's always also about how the elite in a society or the cows have been able to take a hold of themselves. The point is that others have done it. The law of science says that if something happened in nature, the possibility that it could happen there. So what are the factors? So this is really, for me, the issue. But again, I just want to express my gratitude.
Thank you. So I'm going to open it up for questions. If anybody in the crowd has anything, please raise your hand. I'll get the ball rolling. I want to start off first question, if I may. And it built a little bit on one of the comments that David was making towards the end of his comments, but also your comment about, you see the goal as being focusing on intra-African trade. You said intra-African trade of manufacturers. Otherwise, I think if I'm quoting you right, we're just trading poverty. Okay? So the central tension there, always in the industrial policy debates, is that there's usually somebody out there who can make it more efficiently and inexpensive. And so you're to develop the local production capabilities, you have to be willing to sustain for a certain period of time that you're going to be buying a more expensive locally produced product. Because if you can make it at the same price point as the foreigners, you would already be making it. And so one of the keys has to be, I would think, among countries that all have fairly low levels of per capita income, is thinking about it on a regional or sub-regional or somewhat continental basis in order to have bigger sizes of the markets to achieve some economies of scale so that eventually the goods can basically face international competition and stand on their feet. And that then gets me to the question of, so much of your book and your thinkings about political leadership to coordinate industrial policy is, who is the political leadership that we're talking about here? Is it at the national level? Is it at the continental level, at the AU? Is it at the sub-regional level, sort of, which is I think what David was alluding to? But it doesn't make any sense for 40-odd countries all to be investing in producing the same manufactured good. You have to basically be regionally integrating. So who coordinates that? So it's really a political, when we talk about political leadership here, at what level of political leadership are we talking about? I was actually going to ask you for it. Okay, but you can ask the AVSO. I'm sure they were saying this as well. But
so I believe that's why STA was set up. Yeah, we working with them. We have a close collaboration.
We meaning the back.
AFDB. I'm actually on the Industrialization Council of Street. I believe that secretariat starts with coordination. But David mentioned the case of the elite in, say, Nigeria that never really arrived at a consensus early. And I always sort of reduce that to some level of coordination even at the national level, at the bureaucratic level.
Yeah.
There is a sense in which a lot of the bureaucrats don't even understand, and I'm sorry to put it this way, the implication of acting beyond narrow national or sectoral interests when it comes to the bigger regional trade issues. It plays out also, even in very micro versus meso level. I deal with bureaucracy a lot, in establishing the special agro zone in Nigeria. In fact, we just raised $2.2 billion commitment for 10 states. And you encounter people who could not actually begin to see the bigger picture of building zones. And I always give them an example about that concept. Look, we are talking about 20 zones. Vietnam has 600 industrial parks. But you see an officer whose view and whose range of knowledge about the issue is so narrow, he or she cannot conceptualize beyond what he knows about his own small domain. So I think so you could actually create a hierarchy of understanding that way. So it's about knowledge, it's about enlightenment, it's about acting beyond your particular groups and interests. David was mentioning complexity of Nigeria, is the ethnicity, all kinds of things. So it's a real conundrum. But to answer your question, I think KFC starts at that regional level, but layers upon layers of people and bureaucrats also should do their job. Basically, if each nation should do what they need to do, they will help the secretariat to be able to get the outcome that the heads of state have set for them. So, well, I don't know whether I've answered your question, but I'm very clear about the fact that, I do not think that diversified enough. Some of these figures get thrown around, but you go look at the details. It's very little in terms of value addition. You can say whatever, but the fact of the matter is, the whole of the GDP of Africa is what China exports in 1 year. Just as simple as that.
Thank you. Anybody in the audience have any questions for Bandri? Or maybe you can introduce yourself as well.
My name is Jonathan. I'm a consultant. Thank you very much, Professor Yinka, for your talk. Who's speaking today? My name is Jonathan. I'm a consultant for a small consultancy nearby. Thank you very much, Professor Yinka, for your talk. Why you such out so you can talk at China? My question was more just about your shock mechanism. So I know you mentioned that you studied Nigeria from the 1970s to present, and you do make a strong comparison with Korea. But Korea had, a huge amount of shocks in the early 20th century, from Japanese colonial oppression to World War II and the Korean War. And why was Korea specifically able to get over those shocks, whereas African countries hadn't been able to get over shocks like SAPs and changes in the 2000s?
Well, two quick points on Korea. You're right. Korea benefited from existing technologies and industrial base that Japanese had built, even though they were the colonial masters. It's very different from what we found in Africa. It was very clear. You read the Armsden's book, The Rise of the Rest. You see very detailed portrayal of what Japanese did. So Korea was able to build on it. But the second point comes to the leadership issue of that topic, which was Park Chung-hee. While Korea was, it was worse, the situation was worse than what we had in Africa at independence. People were talking about how to eat breakfast once a day. But here was a leader who said to them, I want to take you to where you've never been before. I know you want to eat, but what I see is an industrial Korea. I do not want the North to override Korea. So he actually adopted steel and heavy chemicals. And there's some discussion of it in the book. He said steel is power. And he had two things about it. That was security and industrial base. They were driven by the fact that North Korea was going to overrun South Korea. So it was just so focused on it. You can be hungry all you want, but you won't have a country left if somebody overruns you. So it was really focused on it. And it encountered the same barriers that we also had. By the way, Nigeria also started a steel plant. My colleague here, we were together in that steel plant. That's where we started that career. 2 years apart from POSCO. POSCO was the Ouyang Steel Company in Korea. We started something called a Jakarta Steel Company. We were just 2 or 3 years apart. And the same barrier we encountered, Korea went to the World Bank. They refused to finance it. Korea now went back to Japan, which was their colonial masters. So, because actually he had served in the Manchurian army, he had friends there and was able to convince people, and Nippon came and built POSCO. I think the first phase of POSCO, and that company got built in 3 years. Up till today, we have not made our own to work. So this is why I'm always very critical about the Nigerian elite. We have examples, clear examples of what others did. And that's why we took the approach, looking at sectors. One of the things that Park also did was that, he, in fact, this is very fascinating. He had a meeting every week with the management of that steel company until they completed phase 1. He was Can you imagine a head of state was meeting with them every week? It was there. We started at Jakarta together with my colleague. We never had such leadership. We never had such oversight. People were picked because they came from somewhere as a minister, and So it's leadership was very important to the success of Korea. And in fact, the idea of learning to produce, learning to maintain that plant was put in motion by that aspect. By the second phase of the Pohang plant, they had less than 20% foreigners, and they completed it like 3-4 months behind schedule. So they were building the plant and learning at it. This is what Africa has done. They by phase 3 of Pohang, they designed it themselves, they built it themselves with the output from phase 1 and 2. So that is the difference in the trajectory of industrialization and also in terms of leadership. They were very clear about what they wanted to do. They will build phase 1 with the help of foreigners, 80%. Second phase, they had 20%. By third phase, today they produce close to 60 million tons of steel. The World Bank itself that denied them money at that time described Pohang Steel Company as the most efficient company in the world. Steel company in the world. So the Korea case is very illustrated of the kind of thing that we were talking about.
Yes. Thank you. Thank you, Banji. I just want to ask questions around wider issues of trade and how this might impact its trajectory in Africa. Your book is primarily about technical change and learning and unlearn as has occurred around Africa. Now, the recent development with BRICS, right, and due to global trade, the choice is being made by China to export manufacturing capacity as against just goods into Africa. Is this a potential for a paradigm shift? And maybe instigating that development by being in the gap between the basic agriculture and exported coffees from China now becoming agents of training and technical change.
Yeah, go ahead.
No, I think China pivoting to Africa is not altruistic. It's a strategy. You look at the development of Indonesia over time, Japan, Korea, Thailand, Hong Kong, Singapore. You see the whole flying geese theory. You get to a point where it's difficult for you to produce certain goods and services. So basically, you just have to, because of labor cost in particular. So we see a lot. In fact, we get a lot of queries from Chinese companies now who are relocating. In fact, in the program I'm doing, we have several of them coming to locate in yes, and I think we should take advantage of it. For me, I don't have an ideological issue with these things. Some people do, but I don't. I think it's about how you negotiate. Several American companies, British companies in China doing business with them. So why shouldn't Africa do business with China? So yes, to your question, I think we should take advantage of the idea that Chinese companies now want to locate. In fact, it's been long in coming in the last 10 years. There have been several of them because they cannot just produce at that level of labor cost because of the rising living standard in China anymore. So it's just the way it is probably going to work. But again, it's about African leaders exerting that leadership, not just looking for rates in exporting commodities to China. Africa has some huge amount of minerals, called DRC, cobalt, also, So I believe that Africa should pay very, very specific attention and explicit policies in agriculture, in mineral processing, and not just ship away all this stuff. It's easy to do it. It's convenient. Let me say it's convenient to just sit back, somebody comes, mine your gold, mine your cobalt, takes it away, you get some money. And then they sell back to you 20, 30 times the value. So I think we should take advantage of what is happening. It's going to be happening very rapidly until now with the tariff thing in America.
I'm not sure. Did you want to add something?
There are lots of things. Can I?
Yeah, the mic is yours.
Yeah. I thought I've got a lot of things to say. Starting from David's intervention, because there's a cat amongst the pigeons, and so I have to react, and I can't let a good debate go waste. Couple of points. Yeah. So David, thanks. Actually, I really liked a lot of the things you said. I'm looking forward to work closely with you. But I mean, I think, just to sort of like having read Benji's book and reacting to your comments, I think Benji's book is not about all the sectors in Nigeria. It's not about the creative industries. It's not about banking. It's really about structural change. It's about industrialization, right? So the sectors he's picking and the focus in the book is from that perspective. Then I also see that, when I go to Nigeria, for instance, I see Nigeria very differently, like from a Nigerian would see Nigeria. It's like an elephant, and we all touch and feel the elephant from the angle in which we see it. And I suppose if I'd write a book on India, right? I mean, probably it would be terrible because because I would find so much more to critique about India than anybody else who actually sees India from around. Because I suppose if it's your country, then you probably have to clean up behind the elephant every day, more or less, or lament why the elephant didn't go fast enough, or what happened. So it's a very different perspective. And Banji's scholarship, I think, has to be put in that perspective, and also in the perspective of his other books. Particularly, I think that you've written previously on state capabilities. I think in the book it's called From Consumption to Production, or one of your past books. So I think that that's in the perspective in which I would see the book. Also, Tandika's work is really, I agree with you, it's fantastic, and he was a dear friend. And I think the common thread between Tandika's work and Banji's work, if I can relate the two now, is that Tandika talks about two spheres of influence in the development state, ideological and structural, right? And Banji, when you talk about leadership in this book, for instance, you're talking about that. You're talking about these two spheres of influence without actually mentioning about it, but talking about, so if you have an ideological perspective on the developmental state, okay, what is the voice with which you take that forward? How do you implement it? Who are the doers of that kind of thinking? And this is actually very important today in Africa. And I think, Ken, your question was really pertinent. And we see that now in the pharmaceutical sector quite a bit. And I can reflect on that, is that we have an African vision now to build vaccine production capacity by 2040, right? To produce 60% in the continent. But then every country in Africa would like to produce vaccines. And there are at least more than 13 countries now which have actually declared intent to set up vaccine production capacity. But from a industrialization perspective, you then have to start thinking about, okay, are we going to have a fallacy of composition? What is going to happen? Every country cannot develop a pharmaceutical sector. We cannot overinvest in a particular direction. How are we going to coordinate that at the continental level, at the regional level, sub-regional level? And how are we going to create a market which is conducive enough particularly to pay more in the beginning because it's going to cost us more to produce those vaccines in Africa. But then how are we going to make sure that those vaccines then become less expensive over time because they have to meet healthcare objectives? And I think those require different kinds of state capabilities that we haven't really even started to think about in a certain way, because most of the literature on state capabilities, even Thandika's and everyone else's until now, looks at state capabilities within a country. We're not looking at state capabilities to coordinate something at the regional level and then sub-regional level, then implement that at the national level, and I think that that's where the challenge is. And that's where actually working more on this literature is really, really important moving forward. I'm going to end with two things. One, I completely disagree with you on the development box, and I'll tell you why. See, it goes on to prove my point than yours. So WTO, for instance, had the agreement on agriculture, and it restricted through free trade agreements and other provisions the space for countries. The development box was created as a means to expand that space. I agree with you that Africa is not using the development box, but it still speaks to the shrinking policy space and the need to create something called the development box. So once again, brings us back to the question of state capabilities, right? So if we had more state capabilities, we would be implementing the development box in Africa, so to speak. But it doesn't. So, but on the policy space, it shrunk. So that's one thing. And for Wallace's question, I think, relocating is useful because they will also bring the skills to produce if they produce. And that will lead to tacit know-how. And that would lead to information on production for African farms and African people. And that tacit labor, if it moves around, will spread tacit know-how for production in Africa. So I would agree that, having more Chinese producers, Indian producers, European producers in Africa would mean opportunities, actually. But we really need policymakers to take advantage of.
Peter, do you want to give anything up? And then I got questions.
Yeah, no, just this question of, the cross-boundary issues. Yes, this is, I think, an area where more work and more research is needed, which has not been written on state capability of the cross-boundary sorts of issues. And I know, Ken, this is something that you've raised before. You raised it again that not every African country could have a production facility in every sector, so to say. It's not feasible because 54 countries, median GDP is 16 billion. The market, the scale, competitiveness, and so on. And it's very clear the work we did recently on the automotive sector. It's clear that you have two main producers, South Africa and Morocco today. Nigeria is, those are two hubs. The South African industry is better integrated within Africa, whereas the Moroccan industry is more outward looking towards Europe, both from the upstream and downstream. The African Association of Automotive Manufacturers are making the case that there needs to be consolidation in that industry, with perhaps 3 hubs, including Nigeria, just because of the size of the markets and so on. So I think that kind of leadership we only see will come from the sector itself. In this case, the automotive sector, the leadership in that sector, looking at the whole industry globally and saying, on the African side, especially this transition now to electric vehicles and so there's an opportunity here, but that opportunity needs to be managed and coordinated. So I think that seems to be coming from the industry. Pharmaceutical sector is not a sector studied to know much about it, but I would imagine that a similar strategy is possible, especially now with these specialized agencies that you have under the African Union that could look into this, the kind of consolidation that would be that be needed. Also, I quite agree with excuse me, I quite agree with the point that has been made on China that as wages increase in China, there's some sectors, some specific activities that Chinese firms are looking at moving to lower wage economies, and Africa could benefit from this. And excuse me, and we're beginning to see this happen already to some degree. There's scope for more of that, especially as clearly I think what we are seeing now is a shift happening in China where it's going to be much more focused on its own economy and consumption, growing consumption in the Chinese economy. It does mean that those sectors that have strongest what could potential could move. Although the immediate neighborhood around China, Vietnam, Cambodia, etc., much likelier targets than the African ones, but there's a scope there. I think we should have much discuss policy space. What about stuff we're not going to be here?
I'll have fun with you.
Yeah, on you as well.
Yeah.
You had a question, sir. Didn't you have that report? Yeah.
Can you the mic?
I don't need some more.
Yeah. I've got so here. Yeah, I'll go to.
I think you have to stand.
You insinuated that Nigeria has a Malaysia. You are not agree that. We have seen over the years failure in leadership, even though we grow a large population of elites, which Banji or what? What has failed us?
He's one of them.
What has failed us as a country is well documented, but we've never been able to address it as an issue. Do you think that with all the frameworks that we now have, whether we could take, rather than look at state capability, can we look at regional capability and try to see whether applying those issues to a smaller unit will help demonstrate what a region could do rather than the state? In any case, any of the regions we're talking of in Nigeria are larger than those countries other than China. Larger than most of these countries we mentioned. What do you feel about this?
Thank you, Deji. I think so. When Deji speaks of region, it's talking of regional within Nigeria. That was how we started life in the 50s, 60s. We were regions until we were no more regions due to evolution of the Nigerian society. The military came and centralized everything. Just to put the context, we had three main regions: Western region, Eastern region, and Northern region. It got broken into about 6 or so. We have and people feel that it worked. That political structure that we had, that it was working. There was a lot of competition between the regions. The what we call now Southwest Western region was far advanced to everybody. We had free educations in 1955 in that region, and the Eastern region began to copy it. So there was a lot of competitive political competition among the regions, and things were growing. And also, we had a parliamentary system that was very similar to what we have in the UK. Although the military came, and they are more used to command and control, so they centralized everything, adopted the American type system, which I agree with you has not worked. It's too expensive, it's too unwieldy, it's too big for the kind of a system of political management is too expensive for Nigeria. A lot of people have made that advocacy that we should return to those regional arrangements. It's because when system get entrenched, it's difficult. The same people who are now there, who are more or less being the beneficiaries of the system, are the ones who were asking to change it. So it's been extremely difficult. Even though, ordinary people are saying, let's go back to this, let's go back to that. So I agree with you, Deji, that for me, that would be my preference. Whether we can achieve it or not, I don't know. But that would be my preference. That Nigeria goes back to the regional system. What we have is too, I don't want to say words that, but I think it's difficult. And we're not moving forward. It would seem that one government is not an improvement of the previous one, and this is what we have. So let me stop there before I say too many.
So it sounds to me, if I could pop in, that you're suggesting, putting this together with the previous conversation, you want a delegation away from the national government below to like to decentralize. Yeah. So you also want a delegation away from the national government above to sort of more regional African AU level policy making. So you sort of have delegation going on in both directions. Now, is that a fair reading?
Yeah. Yeah. So for the national level in Nigeria, I mean, I've been very specific about Nigeria because of its size. 230 million people is a huge country with vast land, vast cultural differences, ethnicity, 250 languages. Is very complex. And the designers of our constitution in the beginning said, look, create all of these poles of ethnic homogeneity, and but still remain a nation, more or less like a federation that we have. So, but of course, at the regional African level, yes, of course, you have to agree that. But I think this question is very specific to Nigeria, that we need to decentralize. I think the word is decentralize on the center. There's too much power there. The fiscal autonomy is very low for the states. Now we have states, 36 states. That's what we have now. And it evolved over time. The military kept dividing and dividing. We were 12, then it became 34, then it became this. Each one comes and begin to splinter the whole country into this. But the sentiment now is that, this is too expensive. And really, that's really and that there should be more fiscal decentralization for regions to have more autonomy. That's
Thank you. Anything from this side? Yeah. You have Al-Tehran?
My name is Need and Lawyers. So a bit a selfish question. So I work within infrastructure as a consultant. And my question is, what's the role in the infrastructure deficits in industrialization in Africa? And using Nigeria as an example, seeing that actually we have very much an entrepreneurial spirit, and private sector usually willing to play their parts given the right environment. We see that in banking, which was alluded to, in telecoms, in Nollywood. But when we look at manufacturing, there's just so many barriers to entry, from energy to roads, transport. And even if you look at Dangote, who has been relatively successful in that field, it's been a challenge for him to even just move goods across Nigeria, talk less of moving goods from Nigeria to any other country for trade.
Well, thank you, Pakshan.
Yeah. I'm gonna just answer this. We've done a lot of work in the past, actually, Benji and myself, talking about the problems of infrastructure barriers to build manufacturing. So year after year, we did industrialization service in Africa in different sectors, different countries. And what we generally found was there was like three levels of issues for African farmers. One was really physical infrastructure related, so water, electricity, road, transport. The second one was really knowledge infrastructure, so skills, R&D investment, missing public sector or support systems. The third one was really linkages. So there was absolutely no collaborative linkages that you would see, which is really critical for manufacturing to emerge and capabilities required for advanced manufacturing very much. But to answer your question, our next book, the one on state capabilities for industrialization, we're looking particularly on how infrastructure could give the target push for developing manufacturing, because one of the key things that is a challenge for African states today and African policymakers is really to mobilize domestic resources for investment, which is something that is called on in economics, but we don't know how African countries are going to do that given the current restrictions and the public budget deficits that they have. So we're analyzing the role of infrastructure, which is anyway, there's a lot of infrastructure investment ongoing and scheduled to take place in Africa. How can we use that to crowd in investments and to actually facilitate manufacturing? That's one of the ETs that we're looking.
Yeah, just to corroborate that, NE is involved in some big infrastructure, and I really commend it for very bold, one of those bold Nigerians who are really pushing the boundaries. The Abidjan-Lagos corridor, the African Development Bank is financing it. We have several such corridors across Africa that we finance it. Even the project that I'm leading now is about infrastructure. The special industrial processing zones is about creating these zones and putting the right infrastructure, because what you find is that, you have the hinterland, the peri-urban areas where farmers are, they cannot get their goods to where they'll be processed or where they'll be eaten or where they'll be exported. So you have huge post-harvest losses by farmers. 70% in some cases to produce tomato or whatever it is. They don't have transport for 3 kilometers to get it across. So what the bank has been doing is to establish these special growth zones. Just imagine like 100 hectares or 200 hectares of land. So we carve it out, working with the particular government of that state. And then we put road, water, sewage, power, everything in that zone. They have fence around. I can show you some pictures of one of them that's already ongoing. The first set of stake were 8 of them, for which we raised close to $600 million, and we're dispersing now. Some of them were already building. The second set of states are coming on board, going to our board by end of May. So infrastructure is critical, very critical. I was talking to the Saudi finance minister. We had a meeting with them in Vienna at the OFID office. And he was telling me that Saudi imports $25 billion worth of food every year. And he said that we import 0 from Africa. And you guys are just 3-4 hours away from us. We go all the way to Ukraine, to New Zealand, to Australia. And what was missing? Infrastructure. The ports, the rail, and all of those things. So there's a huge opportunity to correct this. It's been lingering for decades that we've not invested in infrastructure. And the African Investment Forum also that the bank started has been really mobilizing money for infrastructure. It started in 2018, and over the 4 cycles of the African Investment Forum, we've raised about $180 billion in financial commitment. And these are monies mostly within Africa. The EIF is supposed to raise more within Africa, from pension fund, from trust fund, from all kinds of areas. So I encourage you to bring your project to the AIF this year. So it's a big issue. It's a very big issue for us.
Thank you very much.
Jonathan, right? You has a question?
Yeah, sir. One last question. I mean, I know you talked a bit about the elephant in the room, but I think with Nigeria specifically, could you address the insecurity situation? Because I mean, you have industrial sabotage in the southeast, and you have, the construction of parallel states across the north. So, is a coherent industrial policy really reconcilable with persistent insecurity across the country?
Insecurity. Yeah, I mean, it's an issue. It's an issue across all of Sahel. Ever since whatever happened, I don't go into details. The whole of Sahel have been open to all of these terrorism issues. From Burkina to Mali to Chad to Nigeria. The whole of northern Nigeria has been Niger. So, and we have to deal with it. We have to deal with the issue. For every zone, the zones are all fenced round. There are zones where the assets are protected. And I always say to people that if you have a home, you are going to abandon your home and say, okay, because there are some people who come, you defend your home. So if you need to put whatever necessary assets to make sure those things don't happen. So we are very mindful of it. It's part of the policy of the zones to make sure the zones are protected, the area that people can come and work and live. Yeah. So, yeah. Thank you.
Great. So let me just take a quick moment here to thank everybody for showing up, especially, well, not especially, but including the students who I know have exams coming up. So everyone's got their brains thinking that the students, this is exam season. So, but thank you. Thank you very much, Banji, and congratulations on your book. Thank you, Padma Shri and David, for your comments. And thank you very much, Deepa Patel from our department who helped organize this and management and set it all up. And I would just hopefully you'll join me in giving Banji and co-author congratulations to